When you walk through the streets of Berlin today, you might notice something extraordinary hidden beneath the surface of this bustling metropolis. The cobblestones tell stories of empires that rose and fell. The buildings whisper tales of division and reunification. And the very air seems thick with the weight of history that shaped not just Germany, but the entire world. Tonight, we'll uncover how a modest medieval trading post transformed into one of Europe's most powerful capitals, survived complete destruction, endured decades of bitter division, and ultimately emerged as a symbol of hope and unity that continues to inspire millions. This is the complete story of Berlin, a city that has witnessed more dramatic transformations than perhaps any other capital on Earth. We'll begin our journey in the marshy forests of medieval Brandenburg, and from there, we'll trace the remarkable evolution of a settlement that would eventually become home to nearly 4 million people. Berlin has weathered invasions, revolutions, world wars, and the most infamous wall in modern history to become one of the world's most influential cities. So just relax and let your mind wander as we explore the captivating history of Berlin, a city that refused to be defined by its darkest chapters. When you think of Berlin, perhaps you picture the Brandenburg Gate standing majestically against the skyline, or tourists exploring the remnants of the Berlin Wall, or the glass dome of the Reichstag reflecting the morning sun. This city feels like the very heart of modern Europe, a place where East meets West and where the future is constantly being reimagined. And indeed, Berlin sits at the geographical centre of the European continent, making it a natural crossroads for trade, culture, and ideas. As the location of countless historic events, and with its stunning mix of classical and contemporary architecture, there's an undeniable sense that this place has witnessed it all the triumphs and tragedies that have unfolded over the centuries. But the story of Berlin begins long before the grand monuments and government buildings that define its skyline today. The area we now call Berlin was once a wilderness of dense forests, winding rivers, and scattered settlements where Germanic tribes lived simple lives far removed from the great civilizations of Rome and Constantinople. It's fascinating to imagine that here, where sleek trams glide past modern office buildings, ancient hunters once tracked deer through primeval woodlands. However, the true history of Berlin must begin with its human inhabitants and their gradual transformation of this landscape. Humans had been living in the Berlin area for thousands of years before any permanent settlement took root. Archaeological evidence suggests that various Germanic tribes established temporary camps and seasonal settlements throughout the region during the early medieval period, drawn by the abundant forests, fertile soil, and the strategic advantages offered by the Spree River. During the early medieval era, around 500 to 1000 CE, communities in this part of Europe were transitioning from purely nomadic lifestyles to more settled agricultural practices. The hunter-gatherer way of life was gradually giving way as people learned to cultivate crops and establish permanent villages. By the 10th century, the Berlin area consisted of scattered Slavic settlements along the banks of the Spree River. These early communities were small, perhaps housing no more than a few dozen families each, but they represented the first steps toward what would eventually become one of Europe's great cities. The region was characterized by its challenging geography. Vast forests stretched in every direction, broken only by rivers, marshlands, and occasional clearings where brave settlers had carved out space for their modest farms. Travel was difficult and dangerous, with wild animals and bandits posing constant threats to anyone venturing beyond the safety of their village walls. Life in these early settlements was hard and uncertain. Residents depended entirely on what they could grow, hunt, or trade with neighbouring communities. Winters were brutal, and crop failures could mean starvation for entire families. Yet these hardy pioneers persevered, slowly but steadily expanding their influence throughout the region. The first official mention of a settlement called Berlin appears in historical records around 1244, though the area had been inhabited for centuries before this date. The name itself likely derives from an old Slavic word meaning swamp, or dry place in a swamp, which perfectly describes the marshy landscape that characterized much of the region. In those early days, Berlin was actually two separate settlements located on opposite sides of the Spree River. On the north bank stood Berlin proper, while on the south bank lay its sister town of Köln. These twin communities were connected by a simple wooden bridge and shared many common interests, though they maintained separate governments and distinct identities for several centuries. Both settlements were established primarily as trading posts, taking advantage of their strategic location along important medieval trade routes. Merchants travelling between the wealthy cities of northern Germany and the growing markets of Eastern Europe found these riverside communities to be convenient stopping points where they could rest, resupply, and conduct business. The early residents of Berlin and Köln were a diverse mix of German colonists, Slavic locals, and travelling merchants from across Europe. This multicultural character would remain a defining feature of Berlin throughout its long history, as the city repeatedly attracted newcomers seeking opportunity and refuge. Trade quickly became the lifeblood of these growing settlements. Local craftsmen produced goods that were highly valued by passing merchants, including leather products, metalwork, and textiles. The fertile land surrounding the towns yielded surplus grain that could be sold to feed the populations of larger cities. As commerce flourished, both Berlin and Köln began to expand beyond their original boundaries. New neighbourhoods sprang up to accommodate the growing population of traders, artisans, and their families. Simple wooden structures gave way to more substantial buildings constructed of stone and brick, creating the foundations of what would eventually become a major urban centre. The rulers of Brandenburg, the larger territory that encompassed Berlin and Köln, recognised the strategic and economic importance of these riverside settlements. They granted various privileges and protections to encourage further growth, including the right to hold regular markets and collect tolls from passing merchants. By the 13th century, both communities had developed into proper medieval towns, complete with defensive walls, organised guilds, and formal governments. The population had grown to several thousand residents, making them among the largest settlements in the Brandenburg region. However, life in medieval Berlin and Köln was far from easy. The towns faced constant threats from rival lords, bandits, and foreign armies. Disease outbreaks were common, and fires could devastate entire neighbourhoods in a matter of hours. The wooden buildings and narrow streets that characterised medieval urban planning made these communities particularly vulnerable to such disasters. Despite these challenges, the twin towns continued to prosper. Their location at the intersection of several major trade routes ensured a steady flow of commerce, while their growing reputation for quality craftsmanship attracted customers from across Northern Europe. The relationship between Berlin and Köln during this period was complex and often contentious. While they shared many common interests and frequently cooperated on matters of mutual concern, they also competed for trade and political influence. This rivalry would persist for generations, shaping the character of both communities. In 1307, the two towns finally agreed to merge their governments while maintaining separate identities. This union created a more powerful political entity that could better defend its interests against external threats and negotiate more effectively with regional rulers. The merged city, which retained the name Berlin, quickly emerged as one of the most important commercial centres in the Brandenburg region. Its strategic location, combined with the entrepreneurial spirit of its residents, positioned it for even greater growth and influence in the centuries to come. As we move into the 14th century, we can see the early foundations of what would eventually become one of Europe's great capitals. The industrious merchants and craftsmen of medieval Berlin had created something remarkable from the marshy wilderness along the Spree River, establishing patterns of trade, innovation, and cultural diversity that would define the city for centuries to come. The transformation was already underway, though none of these early Berliners could have imagined that their modest trading town would one day become the seat of empire, the epicenter of global conflict, and ultimately a symbol of freedom and unity that would inspire the world. And unity that would inspire the world. The 14th century brought both tremendous opportunities and devastating challenges to the growing city of Berlin. As trade routes expanded across Central Europe, Berlin found itself positioned at the heart of an increasingly complex commercial network that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. Merchants arriving from distant lands brought not only exotic goods and precious metals, but also new ideas, technologies, and cultural influences that would gradually transform the character of the city. The Hanseatic League, that powerful confederation of merchant guilds and trading cities, began to take notice of Berlin's strategic importance. While Berlin never became a full member of this influential organization, it developed close trading relationships with several Hanseatic cities, particularly Hamburg and Lübeck. These connections opened up lucrative markets for Berlin's craftsmen and provided access to goods from across the known world. During this period, the city's population swelled to nearly 8,000 residents, making it one of the largest urban centers in the Holy Roman Empire's eastern territories. This growth created new challenges and opportunities that would test the resilience and ingenuity of Berlin's inhabitants. The most significant development of this era came in 1415, when Frederick of Hohenzollern was appointed Margrave of Brandenburg by the Holy Roman Emperor. This marks the beginning of Hohenzollern rule over Berlin, a dynasty that would govern the city and its surrounding territories for more than 500 years, ultimately transforming a modest trading town into the capital of a great European power. Friedrich, later known as Frederick I of Brandenburg, immediately recognized Berlin's potential as more than just a commercial hub. He envisioned the city as the administrative center of his growing domain, a place where political power and economic influence could be consolidated to maximum effect. Under Hohenzollern rule, Berlin underwent its first major transformation from a merchant town into a princely residence. Friedrich ordered the construction of a fortified castle on the southern bank of the Spree in the heart of Old Cologne. This imposing structure, built of stone and designed to withstand siege warfare, served both as the Margrave's residence and as a symbol of his authority over the region. The presence of a permanent court brought profound changes to Berlin's social and economic structure. Noble families began establishing residences in the city to be close to the seat of power, while skilled artisans found new opportunities creating luxury goods for the growing aristocratic population. The demand for elaborate clothing, fine jewelry, ornate furniture, and decorative weapons created entirely new industries within the city. However, the transition from merchant republic to princely capital was not without conflict. Many of Berlin's established merchant families viewed the Hohenzollern rule as a threat to their traditional autonomy and commercial privileges. Tensions between the old merchant elite and the new aristocratic establishment would simmer for decades, occasionally erupting into open conflict. The most serious confrontation occurred in 1448, when Berlin's citizens, led by the merchant guilds, rose in revolt against Margrave Frederick II. The uprising, known as the Berlin Indignation, was sparked by the Margrave's attempts to increase taxes and restrict the city's traditional freedoms. For several months, the rebels controlled large portions of the city, even laying siege to the castle. Frederick II's response was swift and decisive. He assembled a powerful army and systematically retook control of Berlin, street by street. The rebellion was crushed with considerable brutality, and many of its leaders were executed or exiled. The Margrave then moved to permanently eliminate the threat of future uprisings by dismantling much of the city's traditional self-governance and placing Berlin under direct princely control. This violent suppression marked the end of Berlin's era as an independent merchant city and the beginning of its transformation into an absolutist capital. While the defeat was traumatic for many residents, it also cleared the way for a period of unprecedented growth and development under strong centralized leadership. The late 15th century saw Berlin emerge as the undisputed center of Brandenburg's political and economic life. The Hohenzollern court attracted scholars, artists, and diplomats from across Europe, gradually transforming the city's cultural landscape. What had once been a primarily commercial community began to develop the sophisticated, intellectual, and artistic traditions that would characterize European capitals. The introduction of printing to Berlin around 1470 revolutionized the spread of ideas and information throughout the region. Books, pamphlets, and official documents could now be produced quickly and cheaply, facilitating everything from government administration to religious education. The city's first printing workshops were established near the castle, serving both the court and the growing population of literate merchants and artisans. Religious life in Berlin during this period remained dominated by the Catholic Church, though the seeds of future religious upheaval were already being sown. Several magnificent Gothic churches were constructed during the late medieval period, including St. Nicholas Church and St. Mary's Church, both of which showcase the growing wealth and ambition of the city's residents. The economic foundation of Berlin's prosperity continued to rest on trade, but the nature of that commerce was evolving. Instead of simply serving as a way station for goods travelling between other cities, Berlin was increasingly becoming a destination in its own right. The presence of the court created demand for luxury items that had to be imported from distant regions, while the city's own craftsmen developed reputations for excellence that attracted customers from across Central Europe. By 1500, Berlin had grown to encompass nearly 12,000 residents, making it one of the most significant cities in the German-speaking world. The urban landscape bore little resemblance to the modest trading posts that had existed just 2 centuries earlier. Substantial stone buildings lined well-planned streets, while the castle complex had expanded to include numerous courtyards, administrative buildings, and defensive structures. The city's walls had been rebuilt and strengthened multiple times to accommodate the expanding population and to incorporate new military technologies. These fortifications, while necessary for defense, also served as a powerful symbol of Berlin's growing importance and the determination of its rulers to protect their investment in the city's development. As the 16th century dawned, Berlin stood poised on the threshold of even greater transformations. The Renaissance was beginning to influence art, architecture, and intellectual life throughout Northern Europe, while religious reforms were challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. Political changes across the Holy Roman Empire were creating new opportunities for ambitious rulers to expand their territories and influence. The Hohenzollern dynasty had successfully transformed Berlin from a collection of medieval trading settlements into a proper princely capital, but this was only the beginning of the city's remarkable journey. The foundations had been laid for what would eventually become one of Europe's great powers, though the path ahead would be marked by both spectacular triumphs and devastating setbacks. Looking ahead to the challenges and opportunities of the early modern period, Berlin's residents could hardly have imagined the extraordinary destiny that awaited their city. The modest settlement that had emerged from the marshy forests of Brandenburg was about to embark on a journey that would see it rise to unprecedented heights of power and influence, only to face complete destruction and division, before ultimately emerging as a symbol of hope and reconciliation for the modern world. The arrival of the Protestant Reformation in the early 16th century would prove to be one of the most transformative forces in Berlin's history, reshaping not only the city's religious landscape, but fundamentally altering its political and cultural identity. When Martin Luther's revolutionary ideas began spreading throughout the German territories, Berlin found itself at the centre of a religious upheaval that would have profound consequences for centuries to come. Initially, the Hohenzollern rulers remained cautiously committed to Catholicism, wary of antagonizing the Holy Roman Emperor and disrupting the delicate political balance that had allowed Brandenburg to prosper. However, the appeal of Protestant theology proved increasingly difficult to resist, particularly when it offered the tantalizing prospect of greater independence from papal authority and the opportunity to seize control of valuable church properties. The turning point came in 1539, when Elector Joachim II officially converted to Lutheranism, bringing Berlin and all of Brandenburg into the Protestant camp. This decision was not merely a matter of personal faith, but a calculated political move that would fundamentally reshape the relationship between church and state in Berlin for generations to come. The conversion had immediate and dramatic effects on daily life in the city. Catholic monasteries and convents were dissolved, their vast holdings redistributed to support the electoral court and fund public works projects. The magnificent Gothic churches that had dominated Berlin's skyline were stripped of their Catholic ornaments and transformed into Protestant houses of worship, their walls whitewashed and their elaborate altars replaced with simple communion tables. Many residents embraced these changes with enthusiasm, viewing Protestant theology as a return to authentic Christian principles free from the corruption and excess that had characterized the medieval church. However, others mourned the loss of traditional religious practices and the familiar rhythms of Catholic devotional life that had provided comfort and structure for countless generations. The religious transformation coincided with broader cultural and intellectual changes that were sweeping across Northern Europe during the Renaissance period. Berlin's court began attracting humanist scholars, innovative artists, and progressive thinkers who brought new ideas about education, governance, and social organization. The city's first Latin school was established to provide advanced education for the sons of noble and merchant families, while the court library grew to become one of the most impressive collections in the German territories. Architecture in Berlin during this period reflected the city's growing sophistication and its rulers' desire to project power and cultural refinement. The old medieval castle was extensively renovated and expanded in the Renaissance style, featuring elegant courtyards, elaborate decorative elements, and spacious halls designed for courtly ceremonies and diplomatic receptions. These architectural changes transformed Berlin's skyline and created a visual symbol of the city's evolution from merchant town to princely capital. The population continued to grow steadily throughout the 16th century, reaching approximately 15,000 by 1600. This expansion was fueled not only by natural increase, but also by the constant arrival of new residents drawn by economic opportunities and the relative religious tolerance that characterized 16th century England Protestant Brandenburg. Skilled craftsmen, ambitious merchants, and learned professionals all found opportunities in Berlin that might not have been available in other German cities. Trade remained the foundation of Berlin's prosperity, but the nature of commerce was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The city's merchants developed extensive networks that reached from the Baltic ports to the markets of southern Germany and beyond. Local industries expanded beyond traditional crafts to include more specialized manufacturing, particularly in areas such as armaments production and luxury goods that served the needs of the growing court. The brewing industry, which had existed in Berlin since medieval times, experienced remarkable growth during this period. Berlin beer developed a reputation for quality that extended far beyond the city's borders, creating a valuable export commodity that brought substantial revenue to both brewers and the electoral treasury. The success of this industry reflected broader trends in Berlin's economic development, as local producers learned to capitalize on their proximity to both raw materials and lucrative markets. However, prosperity also brought new challenges and vulnerabilities. Berlin's growing wealth and strategic importance made it an attractive target for foreign armies and ambitious rivals. The city's location at the crossroads of major European trade routes, while advantageous for commerce, also meant that it lay directly in the path of the great military campaigns that periodically swept across Central Europe. The most devastating of these conflicts was the 30 Years' War, which erupted in 1618 and would bring unprecedented destruction and suffering to much of the German-speaking world. Berlin, despite its Protestant allegiance and strategic importance, could not escape the catastrophic effects of this prolonged and brutal conflict. The war began as a religious struggle between Protestant and Catholic forces within the Holy Roman Empire, but quickly evolved into a complex international conflict involving most of the major European powers. Armies marched back and forth across the German territories for 3 decades, leaving destruction and devastation in their wake. Berlin suffered terribly during this period. The city was occupied multiple times by different armies, each demanding tribute, supplies, and quarters for their soldiers. The population, which had grown to nearly 15,000 at the war's beginning, plummeted to fewer than 6,000 by its end. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, trade networks collapsed, and the carefully constructed prosperity of the previous century was swept away by the relentless tide of warfare. The psychological impact of the war was perhaps even more devastating than the physical destruction. A generation of Berliners grew up knowing nothing but conflict, uncertainty, and hardship. The sophisticated court culture that had flourished during the Renaissance gave way to a grim struggle for mere survival, as residents focused all their energy on finding food, shelter, and protection from the seemingly endless parade of hostile armies. Yet even in the midst of this catastrophe, the seeds of Berlin's future greatness were being planted. The war's end in 1648 found the city devastated, but not destroyed, its population depleted but not eliminated, its spirit battered but not broken. The Hohenzollern dynasty had survived the conflict and retained control of Brandenburg, positioning themselves for the remarkable expansion that would follow in the war's aftermath. The Peace of Westphalia, which finally ended the 30 Years' War, established a new political order in Central Europe that would prove highly advantageous to Brandenburg and its capital. The treaty recognized the principle of state sovereignty and religious tolerance, while also redistributing territories in ways that strengthened the position of Protestant powers like Brandenburg. Frederick William, who became Elector of Brandenburg in 1640 during the darkest years of the war, emerged from the conflict with a clear vision of what needed to be done to rebuild his devastated territories. Known to history as the Great Elector, he would prove to be one of the most capable and far-sighted rulers in Berlin's long history. Frederick William understood that military weakness had been the primary cause of Brandenburg's suffering during the war. He was determined to create a standing army capable of defending his territories and projecting power beyond their borders. This decision would have profound implications for Berlin's development, as the city became the center of an increasingly militarized state that would eventually challenge the great powers of Europe. The reconstruction of Berlin began almost immediately after the war's end. New residents were actively recruited from across Europe, with particular emphasis on attracting skilled craftsmen, experienced merchants, and educated professionals who could contribute to the city's economic recovery. Religious refugees fleeing persecution in other territories found welcome in Berlin, adding to the city's diversity and bringing valuable skills and connections. One of the most significant groups of new arrivals was the French Huguenots, Protestant refugees who fled France following Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. These highly educated and skilled immigrants brought sophisticated manufacturing techniques, extensive commercial networks, and cultural refinement that would greatly enhance Berlin's development in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. By 1700, Berlin's population had not only recovered from the devastation of the 30 Years' War, but had grown to nearly 30,000 residents, making it one of the largest cities in the German territories. The urban landscape bore little resemblance to the war-torn settlement of 50 years earlier, as new neighbourhoods, public buildings, and defensive works transformed the city's appearance and functionality. The stage was now set for Berlin's transformation from a regional capital into the seat of a major European power, though few could have predicted the extraordinary events that would unfold over the following decades. The dawn of the 18th century marked the beginning of Berlin's most dramatic transformation yet, as the city prepared to witness events that would elevate it from a recovering regional centre to the heart of a new European kingdom. The ambitious vision of Frederick William's son would soon reshape not only Berlin's skyline, but its entire identity on the continental stage. Frederick III, who became Elector of Brandenburg in 1688, possessed an even grander vision for his capital than his predecessors. Where earlier Hohenzollern rulers had focused primarily on recovery and consolidation, Frederick III dreamed of royal glory and international recognition that would place Berlin among Europe's most prestigious capitals. The opportunity for this transformation came through a combination of political maneuvering and historical circumstance. The War of Spanish Succession had created a complex web of European alliances, and Frederick III recognized that his military support would be valuable to the Holy Roman Emperor. In exchange for providing troops for the imperial cause, Frederick negotiated something unprecedented in his family's history: recognition as king in Prussia. On January 18, 1701, in the East Prussian city of Königsberg, Frederick III crowned himself King Frederick I of Prussia. This ceremony, while taking place hundreds of miles from Berlin, would have profound consequences for the city's future development. Berlin was now the capital of a kingdom, not merely an electorate, and this elevation in status demanded corresponding changes in the city's appearance and functions. The transformation began almost immediately. Frederick I was determined that his capital should reflect the dignity and grandeur befitting a royal residence. He commissioned ambitious building projects that would create a new architectural identity for Berlin, one that combined the best elements of French, Italian, and German design traditions. The most significant of these projects was the construction of a new royal palace, designed to replace the modest castle that had served previous electors. This magnificent Baroque structure, with its elaborate facades and vast ceremonial halls, was intended to rival Versailles in its splendour. The palace complex eventually encompassed multiple courtyards, hundreds of rooms, and extensive formal gardens that stretched along the banks of the Spree River. Construction of the new palace required an enormous workforce, drawing skilled craftsmen from across Europe to Berlin. Italian architects, French decorative artists, Dutch hydraulic engineers, and German master builders all contributed their expertise to creating what would become one of Europe's most impressive royal residences. The project employed thousands of workers over several decades, providing economic stimulus that helped fuel Berlin's continued growth. The royal court that Frederick I established in his new palace was designed to project power and sophistication throughout Europe. Elaborate ceremonies, grand balls, and diplomatic receptions became regular features of Berlin life, attracting visitors from across the continent and establishing the city's reputation as a centre of culture and refinement. However, this pursuit of royal grandeur came at an enormous cost. The construction projects, court ceremonies, and military expenditures required to maintain Prussia's new royal status consumed vast amounts of money that the kingdom could barely afford. By the time Frederick I died in 1713, the royal treasury was nearly bankrupt, and Berlin's magnificent new buildings stood as monuments to both ambition and fiscal irresponsibility. Frederick I's son, who became Frederick William I in 1713, inherited a kingdom in financial crisis and a capital city that had been transformed into a showcase of Baroque splendor, but lacked the underlying economic strength to sustain such magnificence. Known to history as the Soldier King, Frederick William I would prove to be the exact opposite of his extravagant father. Where Frederick I had prioritized ceremony and cultural display, Frederick William I focused obsessively on military efficiency and fiscal responsibility. He immediately began dismantling much of the elaborate court culture his father had created, dismissing hundreds of courtiers, artists, and musicians whose positions he considered unnecessary luxuries. The new king's passion was his army, which he transformed into the most disciplined and professional military force in Europe. Berlin became the center of this military transformation, as the city was reorganized to support the needs of an increasingly powerful standing army. New barracks were constructed throughout the city, parade grounds were laid out for military exercises, and the entire urban landscape began to reflect the militaristic values of its ruler. Frederick William I's most famous military unit was his regiment of tall grenadiers, soldiers who were recruited from across Europe, based primarily on their impressive height. These giants, some over 7 feet tall, became a symbol of Prussian military power and attracted curious visitors from throughout the continent who came to Berlin specifically to witness their precision, drilling, and imposing presence. The Soldier King's emphasis on military preparedness had profound effects on Berlin's civilian population as well. Citizens were expected to contribute to the kingdom's defense through various forms of service and taxation, while the city's economy increasingly focused on supporting military needs. Armament manufacturing, uniform production, and other military-related industries flourished under royal patronage. Despite his reputation for frugality and military obsession, Frederick William I also made significant contributions to Berlin's long-term development. He established new schools throughout the city, recognizing that an educated population was essential for both military and administrative efficiency. The king also implemented urban planning reforms that improved sanitation, expanded the city's boundaries, and created more rational street layouts. One of the most important developments during this period was the expansion of Berlin's population through active recruitment of immigrants. Frederick William I continued his predecessor's policy of welcoming religious refugees and skilled workers, but he pursued this strategy with characteristic systematic efficiency. Government agents were dispatched throughout Europe to recruit settlers, offering generous incentives to anyone willing to relocate to Berlin and contribute to the kingdom's development. These recruitment efforts were remarkably successful. By 1740, Berlin's population had grown to nearly 90,000 residents, making it one of the largest cities in the German-speaking world. The city's demographics had also become increasingly diverse, with substantial communities of French Huguenots, Dutch craftsmen, Jewish merchants, and immigrants from dozens of other European regions. This diversity created a unique cultural atmosphere in Berlin that distinguished it from other German cities of the period. Multiple languages could be heard on the streets. Different religious traditions coexisted with remarkable tolerance, and the constant exchange of ideas between various ethnic and professional communities fostered innovation and entrepreneurship. The economic benefits of this demographic diversity were substantial. Immigrant communities often brought specialized skills and international connections that opened new markets for Berlin's products. The French Huguenots, for example, established luxury manufacturing industries that produced high-quality textiles, jewellery, and decorative arts that were eagerly sought after throughout Europe. Frederick William I's reign also saw significant improvements in Berlin's infrastructure and public services. New bridges were constructed across the Spree River, connecting different neighbourhoods and facilitating commerce. The city's water supply system was expanded and improved, while new public markets were established to serve the growing population's needs. Education received particular attention during this period, as the Soldier King recognised that military and administrative efficiency required a literate and numerate population. New schools were established throughout the city, while existing educational institutions were reformed and expanded. The curriculum emphasised practical skills alongside traditional academic subjects, reflecting the king's belief that education should serve the state's practical needs. The reign of Frederick William I came to an end in 1740 when he was succeeded by his son Frederick II, who would become known to history as Frederick the Great. This transition marked the beginning of what many historians consider the golden age of Prussian power and Berlin's emergence as one of Europe's most important capitals. Frederick the Great inherited from his father a kingdom with a powerful military, a stable economy, and a capital city that had grown dramatically in both size and sophistication. However, the new king's ambitions extended far beyond mere consolidation of existing achievements. He dreamed of transforming Prussia into a great European power and Berlin into a capital that could rival Paris, Vienna, and London in its cultural and political influence. The pursuit of these ambitious goals would test both the kingdom and its capital in ways that previous generations could never have imagined, setting the stage for conflicts and transformations that would reshape the political map of Europe and establish Berlin's reputation as a city capable of withstanding even the most severe challenges while continuing to grow in power and influence. Frederick the Great's vision for Berlin extended far beyond military conquest and administrative efficiency. He was a passionate advocate for Enlightenment ideals and possessed a sophisticated appreciation for art, literature, and philosophy that would fundamentally transform the cultural character of his capital. Unlike his austere father, Frederick II embraced the notion that true greatness required not only military might, but also intellectual and artistic achievement. The new king's first major challenge came almost immediately after his accession to the throne. In 1740, the death of Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI created a succession crisis that would engulf much of Europe in warfare. Frederick seized this opportunity to assert Prussian power by invading the wealthy Austrian province of Silesia, launching what became known as the War of Austrian Succession. This bold move sent shockwaves throughout European diplomatic circles. Here was the young king of what many considered a second-tier German state directly challenging the mighty Habsburg monarchy. The audacity of the attack surprised even Frederick's closest advisors, but the king had calculated that Prussia's military advantages and the international situation provided a unique window of opportunity. Berlin became the nerve centre for this ambitious military campaign. The city buzzed with activity as generals planned strategy, diplomats negotiated with potential allies, and administrators organised the massive logistical effort required to support armies in the field. Citizens watched with mixture of pride and anxiety as their young king gambled the kingdom's future on the battlefield. The successful conquest of Silesia validated Frederick's bold strategy and established Prussia as a major European power virtually overnight. Berlin's residents celebrated wildly as news of military victories arrived from the front, and the captured province's wealth began flowing into the royal treasury. The city that had once struggled to afford its royal pretensions now found itself at the centre of a genuinely powerful kingdom. However, Frederick understood that military success alone would not secure Prussia's position among Europe's great powers. He needed to transform Berlin into a capital worthy of international respect and admiration. This required not only impressive architecture and efficient administration, but also the cultivation of intellectual and artistic excellence that would demonstrate Prussian sophistication to the world. The king's commitment to Enlightenment principles led him to invite some of Europe's most prominent philosophers and writers to take up residence in Berlin. The most famous of these was Voltaire, the brilliant French philosopher whose wit and wisdom had already made him a celebrity throughout Europe. Frederick's correspondence with Voltaire and his eventual invitation for the philosopher to live at the royal court brought international attention to Berlin's emerging role as a centre of intellectual life. The relationship between Frederick and Voltaire was complex and often turbulent, reflecting the broader tensions between absolute monarchy and Enlightenment ideals. While the king genuinely respected philosophical inquiry and promoted religious tolerance, he also expected his intellectual guests to support his political agenda and defer to his authority. Voltaire's eventual departure from Berlin after several years of residence highlighted these contradictions, but the philosopher's presence had already helped establish the city's reputation as a place where ideas mattered. Frederick's commitment to learning extended to the establishment of the Berlin Academy of Sciences, which brought together scholars from across Europe to conduct research and promote scientific advancement. This institution became a model for similar academies in other capitals and helped position Berlin as a leading centre for intellectual exchange and innovation. The king's personal interests in literature, music, and philosophy deeply influenced court culture in Berlin. He was an accomplished flute player who regularly performed in palace concerts, a prolific writer who produced works on military strategy and political theory, and a patron who supported artists and musicians from throughout Europe. The royal court became renowned for its sophisticated entertainment and intellectual discourse, attracting visitors who came specifically to experience Berlin's cultural offerings. Architecture during Frederick's reign reflected his desire to create a capital that could compete with Europe's most impressive cities. The king commissioned numerous building projects that would transform Berlin's appearance and create lasting monuments to Prussian greatness. The most ambitious of these was the construction of Sanssouci Palace in nearby Potsdam, Frederick's summer retreat, designed as a place where he could escape the pressures of kingship and indulge his philosophical and artistic interests. Within Berlin itself, Frederick ordered the construction of new public buildings, churches, and residential quarters that would accommodate the city's growing population while projecting an image of prosperity and refinement. The famous Unter den Linden Boulevard was expanded and beautified, creating a magnificent ceremonial avenue that connected the royal palace with the Brandenburg Gate. The economy of Berlin during this period reflected the broader transformation of Prussia from a regional power into a European heavyweight. The wealth flowing in from conquered territories, combined with Frederick's reforms of taxation and administration, provided resources for ambitious public works projects and military expenditures. Local industries flourished under royal patronage, particularly those related to luxury goods and military supplies. Trade networks expanded dramatically as Prussian merchants gained access to new markets and established commercial relationships throughout Europe. Berlin's position as the capital of an increasingly powerful kingdom made it an attractive destination for foreign merchants and investors seeking to establish business connections with the Prussian court. The population of Berlin continued to grow throughout Frederick's reign, reaching approximately 150,000 by 1780. This expansion was driven by the city's economic opportunities, its reputation for religious tolerance, and the constant stream of immigrants attracted by Prussia's military success and growing international prestige. However, Frederick's ambitious foreign policy also brought enormous risks and challenges to Berlin and the kingdom as a whole. The 7 Years' War, which began in 1756, would test Prussia's military capabilities and Frederick's leadership to their absolute limits. This global conflict pitted Prussia against a powerful coalition of European powers including Austria, France and Russia, all determined to crush the upstart kingdom and partition its territories among themselves. For 7 grueling years, Berlin lived under the constant threat of enemy occupation. Foreign armies repeatedly invaded Prussian territory, and at several points during the conflict, the capital itself came under direct attack. In 1760, Russian and Austrian forces actually occupied Berlin briefly, forcing Frederick to contemplate the possibility of complete defeat and the destruction of everything he had built. The psychological impact of the war on Berlin's residents was profound. Citizens endured years of uncertainty, economic hardship, and fear as the conflict raged across Central Europe. Food shortages became common, trade networks were disrupted, and many families lost sons and fathers in the endless campaigns that characterized this brutal conflict. Yet Berlin's population also demonstrated remarkable resilience and loyalty to their king during these dark years. Citizens contributed to the war effort through special taxes, voluntary donations, and various forms of civilian service. The city's craftsmen worked tirelessly to produce weapons and supplies for the army, while merchants struggled to maintain trade relationships despite the chaos of war. Frederick's ultimate victory in the 7 Years' War, achieved through a combination of military genius, diplomatic skill, and sheer determination, established Prussia definitively as one of Europe's great powers. Berlin emerged from the conflict as the capital of a kingdom that had proven its ability to stand against the mightiest coalitions and survive the most severe tests. The war's end brought a period of unprecedented prosperity and growth to Berlin. The kingdom's enhanced international status attracted new residents, investors, and trading partners who recognized that Prussia had permanently altered the balance of power in Central Europe. The city that had once struggled for recognition was now the seat of a genuinely formidable European power. Frederick's later years were marked by extensive administrative and legal reforms that further strengthened Prussia's foundations and enhanced Berlin's role as the kingdom's administrative centre. The king's commitment to enlightened governance, combined with his practical understanding of statecraft, produced innovations in law, education, and economic policy that would influence European development for generations. The establishment of a more rational legal system, the promotion of religious tolerance, and the encouragement of economic development all contributed to Berlin's continued growth and prosperity. By the time Frederick died in 1786, he had transformed not only Prussia, but its capital into something that would have been unrecognizable to earlier generations. Berlin in 1786 was a cosmopolitan city of nearly 200,000 residents, a center of learning and culture that attracted visitors from throughout Europe, and the capital of a kingdom whose military and diplomatic influence extended across the continent. The modest trading posts that had emerged from medieval marshlands had been transformed into one of Europe's most important capitals. However, the greatest challenges and transformations in Berlin's history still lay ahead. The French Revolution, which erupted just 3 years after Frederick's death, would unleash forces that would reshape all of Europe and test every assumption about monarchy, society, and governance that had guided Berlin's development for centuries. The revolutionary wars that followed would bring foreign armies to Berlin's gates once again, while new ideas about democracy, nationalism, and individual rights would challenge the very foundations of Prussian society. The city that had survived medieval conflicts, religious upheaval, and international warfare was about to face its greatest test yet, as the old European order crumbled and a new world began to emerge from the chaos of revolution and war. The French Revolution of 1789 sent shockwaves across every European capital, but perhaps nowhere were its implications more carefully studied than in Berlin. Frederick the Great's successors watched with growing alarm as revolutionary fervour swept across France, toppling an ancient monarchy and unleashing radical ideas about popular sovereignty that threatened the very foundations of absolute rule. Frederick William II, who had inherited the Prussian throne in 1786, initially viewed the French chaos as an opportunity rather than a threat. The weakness of France, Prussia's traditional rival, seemed to offer possibilities for territorial expansion and increased influence in European affairs. However, as revolutionary violence escalated and radical ideologies began spreading beyond French borders, Berlin's rulers recognized that they faced an existential challenge to their entire system of government. The execution of King Louis XVI in 1793 horrified European monarchs and convinced them that revolutionary France posed a mortal threat to all established authority. Berlin became a centre of counter-revolutionary activity as Prussia joined the coalition of powers determined to crush the French Republic and restore traditional monarchy throughout Europe. This decision to oppose revolutionary France would have profound consequences for Berlin and its residents. The city once again found itself at the centre of major European conflicts, as Prussian armies marched westward to battle revolutionary forces, while French ideas about liberty, equality, and popular government began filtering into Berlin through underground networks of sympathisers and secret societies. The wars against revolutionary France tested Prussia's military capabilities in ways that even the 7 Years' War had not. The French revolutionary armies fought with an intensity and ideological commitment that surprised traditional European military establishments. These were not mercenary forces fighting for pay and plunder, but citizen soldiers defending what they believed to be the cause of human freedom and national liberation. Berlin's residents experienced the psychological impact of these ideological conflicts in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. Previous wars had been dynastic struggles between competing monarchs, but the Revolutionary Wars represented a clash between fundamentally different visions of how human societies should be organised. The stakes were not merely territorial or commercial, but involved the very nature of political authority and social organisation. The city's intellectual community was particularly affected by these revolutionary currents. Many of Berlin's writers, philosophers, and university professors found themselves torn between loyalty to the Prussian state that had nurtured their careers and sympathy for revolutionary ideals that seemed to offer hope for human progress and liberation from traditional constraints. Secret societies and discussion groups began meeting throughout Berlin to debate revolutionary ideas and consider their implications for Prussian society. Government agents worked tirelessly to monitor these activities and suppress any signs of revolutionary sympathy, creating an atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion that had not existed during Frederick the Great's more tolerant reign. The economic impact of the Revolutionary Wars was severe and immediate. Trade networks that had developed over decades were disrupted as French armies conquered neighbouring territories and imposed revolutionary governments throughout Western Europe. Berlin's merchants found themselves cut off from traditional markets while being forced to contribute ever-increasing amounts to support Prussia's military efforts. Food shortages became common as agricultural production was disrupted by military campaigns and the conscription of rural workers into the army. Prices for basic necessities rose dramatically, creating hardship for ordinary citizens, while the costs of war consumed an ever larger share of government resources. Despite these challenges, Berlin's population continued to grow as refugees from French-occupied territories sought safety in Prussian lands. These newcomers brought first-hand accounts of revolutionary violence and political upheaval that reinforced the government's determination to resist French influence, while also introducing new ideas and perspectives that gradually began changing Berlin's cultural atmosphere. The most dramatic moment in this period came in 1806, when Napoleon Bonaparte, now Emperor of the French, decided to crush Prussian power once and for all. The Prussian army, that had dominated European battlefields under Frederick the Great, suffered catastrophic defeats at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, leaving Berlin defenseless against French occupation. The sight of French troops marching through the Brandenburg Gate was perhaps the most humiliating moment in Berlin's history up to that point. Citizens watched in stunned silence as the symbols of Prussian power were removed or destroyed, while French administrators began implementing revolutionary reforms throughout the occupied city. Napoleon's occupation of Berlin lasted for 2 years and brought revolutionary changes that would have seemed impossible under the old regime. Traditional social hierarchies were challenged, legal reforms were implemented, and new administrative systems were established based on French revolutionary principles rather than Prussian traditions. Many of Berlin's residents initially welcomed some of these changes, particularly those that promised greater legal equality and economic opportunity. The abolition of serfdom, the establishment of civil equality before the law, and the promotion of merit-based advancement appealed to citizens who had been excluded from power and privilege under the old system. However, the French occupation also brought heavy taxation, military conscription, and cultural policies that many Berliners found oppressive and alien. The imposition of French language requirements, the suppression of traditional German customs, and the constant presence of foreign soldiers created resentment that gradually transformed into determined resistance. The experience of occupation fundamentally changed Berlin's character and outlook. Citizens who had previously accepted absolute monarchy and rigid social hierarchies began developing new ideas about national identity, popular participation in government, and resistance to foreign domination. These concepts would profoundly influence Berlin's development throughout the 19th century. The liberation of Berlin in 1813 marked the beginning of a new chapter in the city's history. Prussian forces, supported by Russian and Austrian allies, finally drove the French from German soil and began the process of reconstructing their shattered kingdom. However, the Berlin that emerged from French occupation was fundamentally different from the city that had fallen to Napoleon 7 years earlier. The reform movement that swept through Prussia after 1813 transformed nearly every aspect of Berlin's political, social, and economic life. Traditional privileges were abolished, modern administrative systems were established, and new educational institutions were created to prepare citizens for participation in a more modern and dynamic society. The University of Berlin, founded in 1810 during the French occupation, became a symbol of this reform movement and Prussia's commitment to intellectual excellence. This institution, later renamed Humboldt University, pioneered new approaches to higher education that emphasized research, critical thinking, and the integration of knowledge across traditional disciplinary boundaries. The university's establishment had profound effects on Berlin's cultural and intellectual life. Distinguished scholars from across Europe were recruited to join the faculty, creating an atmosphere of intellectual excitement and innovation that attracted students and researchers from throughout the German-speaking world and beyond. The presence of the university also contributed to Berlin's growing reputation as a center of German nationalism and liberal political thought. Students and professors played leading roles in the political movements that swept across Germany during the first half of the 19th century, advocating for constitutional government, national unification, and individual rights. The economic reconstruction of Berlin after 1815 was equally dramatic. The city's strategic location at the center of the German-speaking world made it a natural hub for the trade networks that began developing as political barriers were reduced and transportation systems improved. The construction of new roads, canals, and eventually railways connected Berlin to markets throughout Central Europe and beyond. Industrial development began transforming Berlin's economic base during this period. Traditional craft production gave way to mechanized manufacturing, while new industries emerged to serve the growing demands of an urbanizing population. Textile production, metalworking, and chemical manufacturing all established significant operations in and around the city. The population of Berlin exploded during the early 19th century, growing from approximately 200,000 in 1800 to more than 400,000 by 1850. This rapid expansion created both opportunities and challenges as the city struggled to provide housing, sanitation, and public services for its rapidly growing population. New neighborhoods were constructed to accommodate the influx of workers, merchants, and professionals drawn by Berlin's economic opportunities. However, many of these developments were hastily planned and poorly constructed, creating overcrowded conditions that would plague the city for decades to come. The social composition of Berlin's population also changed dramatically during this period. The old divisions between nobles, burghers, and peasants gave way to new class distinctions based on wealth, education, and occupation. A growing middle class of professionals, entrepreneurs, and skilled workers began asserting political influence and demanding greater participation in government. Working-class neighborhoods emerged around the new industrial establishments, creating distinct communities with their own cultural traditions and political perspectives. These areas would later become centers of socialist and labor organizing that would play crucial roles in Berlin's political development. The Revolution of 1848 tested all of these social and political changes in the most dramatic way possible. Like many European cities, Berlin exploded in revolutionary violence as citizens demanded constitutional government, national unification, and democratic participation in political decision-making. Barricades went up in the streets as ordinary Berliners fought against royal troops in battles that raged for several days throughout the city. The sight of citizens taking up arms against their own government shocked the Prussian establishment and demonstrated the depth of popular discontent with the existing political system. King Frederick William IV was forced to make significant concessions to the revolutionaries, including the promise of a constitutional monarchy and support for German national unification. For several months it appeared that Berlin might become the capital of a democratic Germany united under Prussian leadership. However, the revolutionary momentum could not be sustained in the face of organized, counter-revolutionary resistance. By 1849, traditional authorities had regained control throughout most of Germany, and the hopes for democratic government and national unification were temporarily crushed. Despite the failure of the 1848 revolution, the events of that year had lasting effects on Berlin's political culture. The experience of popular uprising and democratic participation could not be entirely erased, and many of the ideas that had motivated the revolutionaries continued to influence political discourse throughout the following decades. The period after 1850 saw renewed efforts at modernization and reform, though these were implemented from above rather than through popular pressure. Berlin's role as Prussia's capital made it the center of these reform efforts, while its growing economic importance ensured that changes implemented there would have effects throughout the German-speaking world. The construction of railway networks connecting Berlin to other major German cities revolutionized transportation and communication, making the Prussian capital increasingly central to economic and political developments throughout the German Confederation. By 1860, Berlin had become the undisputed center of German industrial and financial development. The city's cultural life also flourished during this period of rapid growth and modernization. New theaters, concert halls, and museums were established to serve the growing educated population, while newspapers and publishing houses made Berlin a major center of German literary and intellectual life. However, the greatest transformation in Berlin's history was still to come. The wars of German unification in the 1860s would elevate Berlin from the capital of Prussia to the capital of a united German Empire, bringing changes that would dwarf even the dramatic developments of the previous century. Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian minister-president who engineered German unification, understood that success in this endeavour would require not only military victory, but also the creation of new institutions and symbols that could unite the diverse German states under Prussian leadership. Berlin would play a central role in this process, serving as both the practical centre of government and the symbolic heart of the new German nation. The stage was set for Berlin's transformation into one of Europe's most powerful and influential capitals, though the path ahead would be marked by both spectacular triumphs and devastating tragedies that would test the city's resilience in ways that even its long and turbulent history had not prepared it to face. The appointment of Otto von Bismarck as Prussian minister-president in 1862 marked the beginning of the most transformative decade in Berlin's entire history. This brilliant and ruthless statesman possessed a vision that extended far beyond Prussia's traditional boundaries, dreaming of a unified German empire that would reshape the balance of power throughout Europe and establish Berlin as one of the continent's most formidable capitals. Bismarck understood that achieving German unification would require a delicate combination of diplomatic cunning and military force. His strategy, which he famously described as a policy of blood and iron, would test every institution and tradition that had shaped Berlin's development over the previous 6 centuries. The first test came in 1864, with the war against Denmark over the disputed duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. Berlin became the command centre for this carefully orchestrated conflict, as Prussian and Austrian forces collaborated to defeat the Danish army and secure control of these strategically important territories. The successful outcome demonstrated that Prussia had recovered from its humiliating defeats during the Napoleonic era and was once again capable of projecting military power beyond its borders. However, Bismarck's true genius lay not in his military victories but in his ability to manipulate the complex web of European diplomacy to Prussia's advantage. He recognized that Austrian opposition represented the greatest obstacle to German unification under Prussian leadership, and he systematically worked to isolate the Habsburg monarchy from potential allies. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 would prove to be the decisive moment in this grand strategy. Berlin's residents watched with a mixture of excitement and anxiety as their government prepared for what many considered an incredibly risky confrontation with the mighty Austrian Empire. The outcome would determine not only Prussia's future, but the entire structure of Central European politics. The Prussian victory at the Battle of Königgrätz shocked Europe and established Berlin as the undisputed centre of German political power. Austrian influence in German affairs was permanently broken, while the smaller German states found themselves forced to choose between accommodation with Prussia or irrelevance in the new political order. The establishment of the North German Confederation in 1867 represented the first major step toward complete German unification under Prussian leadership. Berlin became the federal capital of this new political entity, which included most German states north of the Main River. The city's administrative apparatus expanded rapidly to accommodate the needs of governing this enlarged territory, while its population swelled with the arrival of officials, diplomats, and businessmen drawn by the new opportunities. The physical transformation of Berlin during this period was remarkable. New government buildings were constructed to house the expanding bureaucracy, while the city's infrastructure was modernized to handle the increased traffic and communication needs of a federal capital. The famous Wilhelmstrasse became the center of German political power as ministries and diplomatic missions established their headquarters along this prestigious avenue. The cultural impact of these political changes was equally significant. Berlin's theatres, concert halls, and universities attracted performers, artists, and intellectuals from throughout the German-speaking world, creating a vibrant cultural scene that reflected the city's new status as the centre of German national life. The Berlin Academy of Arts and the Royal Opera House became showcases for German cultural achievement, while new museums and libraries were established to preserve and celebrate the nation's heritage. However, Bismarck's ultimate goal remained the inclusion of the southern German states in a unified empire. This required one final war, this time against France, which Napoleon III's government unwisely provoked through a series of diplomatic blunders that played directly into Bismarck's hands. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 transformed Berlin into the nerve centre of a national war effort that united Germans as never before. Citizens throughout the German states rallied to support what they perceived as a defensive struggle against French aggression, while Berlin's newspapers and government proclamations helped forge a sense of shared national purpose that transcended traditional regional loyalties. The Siege of Paris and the eventual French surrender created scenes of wild celebration in Berlin's streets. Citizens gathered around newspaper offices to hear the latest reports from the front, while victory parades and patriotic demonstrations became daily occurrences throughout the city. The successful conclusion of the war had achieved something that had seemed impossible just a decade earlier: the complete unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. The proclamation of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles on January 18, 1871, elevated Berlin from a regional capital to the seat of a great European power. King Wilhelm I of Prussia became Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany, while Berlin assumed its new role as the capital of an empire that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Alps and included more than 40 million inhabitants. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Foreign diplomats established embassies in Berlin to conduct business with the new German government, while international banks and trading companies opened offices to take advantage of the expanded market opportunities. The city that had once struggled for recognition among European capitals now found itself courted by governments and businesses from around the world. The population of Berlin exploded in the decades following unification, growing from approximately 800,000 in 1871 to more than 2 million by 1900. This unprecedented expansion made Berlin the third largest city in Europe, behind only London and Paris, and created both tremendous opportunities and severe challenges for urban planners and government officials. The economic boom that accompanied political unification transformed Berlin into one of Europe's major industrial centres. The Krupp Armaments Works, Siemens Electrical Manufacturing, and dozens of other major corporations established operations in or near the capital, taking advantage of its excellent transportation connections and proximity to government decision-makers. The construction of new factories, office buildings, and residential developments changed Berlin's physical appearance beyond recognition. The medieval city centre was largely rebuilt with grand boulevards and imposing structures designed to reflect the empire's power and prosperity, while new suburbs extended the urban area far beyond its historical boundaries. The famous Unter den Linden was expanded and beautified to create a magnificent ceremonial avenue worthy of an imperial capital. The Brandenburg Gate was restored and decorated with patriotic symbols, while new monuments to German military victories were erected throughout the city to remind residents and visitors of the empire's glorious achievements. However, rapid industrialization and population growth also created serious social problems that would plague Berlin for decades to come. Working-class neighborhoods became severely overcrowded as rural migrants streamed into the city seeking employment in the new factories. Living conditions in these areas were often appalling, with entire families crammed into single rooms in hastily constructed tenements that lacked adequate sanitation or ventilation. The emergence of a large industrial working class also created new political challenges for the imperial government. Socialist and labour organisations began forming in Berlin's working class districts, advocating for better working conditions, higher wages, and political representation for ordinary workers. These movements would grow increasingly influential as the empire matured, eventually posing serious challenges to the traditional political order. The Social Democratic Party, founded in 1875, established its headquarters in Berlin and began organising workers throughout the German Empire. Despite government efforts to suppress socialist activities through legislation and police action, the movement continued to grow and attract support from workers who felt excluded from the prosperity that unification had brought to middle and upper-class Germans. Berlin's intellectual and cultural life flourished during the imperial period as never before. The University of Berlin became one of Europe's most prestigious institutions of higher learning, attracting scholars and students from throughout the world. The city's theatres, concert halls, and art galleries showcased the best of German and international culture, while its publishing houses and newspapers helped shape public opinion throughout the empire. The imperial court established elaborate ceremonial traditions designed to project German power and sophistication to the world. State banquets, diplomatic receptions, and military parades became regular features of Berlin life, while the Kaiser's residence was expanded and decorated with magnificent art collections that demonstrated the empire's cultural achievements. Scientific and technological innovation also flourished in Imperial Berlin. The city became a centre for research in physics, chemistry, and engineering, with institutions like the Physical Technical Institute attracting some of the world's most brilliant scientists. These developments would have profound implications for both industrial development and military capabilities in the decades to come. The construction of Berlin's first subway system began in the 1890s, reflecting both the city's growing transportation needs and its desire to match the technological achievements of other major European capitals. The project required enormous investment and engineering expertise, but it demonstrated Germany's commitment to modernization and urban planning. By 1900, Berlin had been completely transformed from the modest Prussian capital of just 30 years earlier. The city now boasted magnificent architecture, world-class cultural institutions, cutting-edge industry, and a population that included representatives from throughout the German Empire and beyond. Visitors from other European capitals were invariably impressed by Berlin's energy, prosperity, and obvious determination to establish itself among the world's great cities. However, this remarkable period of growth and achievement was beginning to show signs of strain as the new century dawned. The rapid changes that had transformed Berlin and the German Empire created new tensions and conflicts that would test the stability of the entire political system. The Kaiser's increasingly erratic behaviour and aggressive foreign policy statements concerned even his closest advisors, while the growing influence of military leaders in government decision-making suggested that the empire was becoming dangerously militarised. International tensions were rising as Germany's rapid growth and assertive diplomacy alarmed other European powers who had grown accustomed to a more fragmented and manageable Central Europe. Within Berlin itself, the contrast between the magnificent public buildings and fashionable districts and the overcrowded working-class neighbourhoods was becoming increasingly stark. Social tensions were mounting as workers demanded better conditions and greater political representation, while traditional elites struggled to maintain their privileged positions in a rapidly changing society. The city, that had achieved such remarkable success through unity and determination, was beginning to experience the internal divisions and external pressures that would ultimately lead to catastrophe. The golden age of Imperial Berlin was approaching its end, though few residents could have imagined the devastating conflicts and transformations that lay just ahead. The stage was set for the greatest crisis in Berlin's long history, as the city that had risen to such heights of power and prosperity prepared to face challenges that would test every institution and tradition that had shaped its remarkable development over more than 7 centuries of continuous growth and adaptation to changing circumstances. The outbreak of the First World War in August 1914 transformed Berlin from a prosperous imperial capital into the command centre of a desperate struggle for national survival. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo had set in motion a chain of events that would engulf all of Europe in the most destructive conflict the world had ever witnessed, and Berlin found itself at the very heart of this unprecedented catastrophe. The initial enthusiasm that greeted the declaration of war was extraordinary to witness. Crowds gathered in front of the royal palace chanting patriotic slogans, while young men rushed to enlist in what many believed would be a brief and glorious campaign. The streets filled with parades and demonstrations, as citizens convinced themselves that German military superiority would ensure rapid victory over their enemies. Kaiser Wilhelm II appeared on the palace balcony to address the cheering multitudes, declaring that he no longer recognized political parties, but only Germans united in defense of the fatherland. This moment of national unity seemed to vindicate everything that Berlin had accomplished since unification, as citizens from all social classes rallied to support the war effort with unprecedented enthusiasm. However, the reality of modern warfare soon shattered these illusions. The German advance through Belgium and France stalled at the Battle of the Marne, creating a static front that would consume enormous resources and countless lives over the following 4 years. Berlin's residents gradually realized that they were facing not a brief campaign, but a prolonged struggle that would test every aspect of their society. The economic impact of the war on Berlin was immediate and severe. The British naval blockade cut off vital imports of food and raw materials, forcing the city's inhabitants to endure increasingly harsh rationing and shortages. By 1916, Berliners were subsisting on ersatz foods made from potato flour and turnips, while basic necessities like soap, clothing and fuel became luxury items available only through black market transactions. The infamous turnip winter of 1916-17 brought genuine starvation to Berlin's working-class neighbourhoods. Endless queues formed outside shops that had little to sell, while desperate citizens scavenged for anything edible in parks and abandoned lots. The mortality rate among elderly residents and children increased dramatically as malnutrition weakened their resistance to disease and infection. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers as men were conscripted for military service. Berlin's factories retooled for wartime production, manufacturing artillery shells, rifles, and poison gas under the direction of female supervisors who had never imagined they would find themselves in such positions. These changes challenged traditional gender roles and created new opportunities for women's participation in public life. The city's cultural institutions struggled to maintain their activities despite the wartime disruptions. Theatres presented patriotic plays designed to boost civilian morale, while museums organised exhibitions celebrating German military achievements. However, many of Berlin's most talented artists, writers, and musicians had been called to military service, leaving a noticeable gap in the city's intellectual life. As the war dragged on, signs of social and political strain became increasingly evident throughout Berlin. Strike activity increased as workers protested deteriorating conditions and demanded better wages to cope with inflation. The Social Democratic Party, despite its initial support for the war effort, began advocating for a negotiated peace that would end the suffering of ordinary Germans. The Russian Revolution of 1917 sent shockwaves through Berlin's political establishment, while inspiring hope among the city's socialist and communist organizations. The prospect of revolution spreading westward terrified government officials and conservative politicians who recognized that Germany's own social fabric was becoming dangerously frayed by the prolonged conflict. Military leaders increasingly dominated government decision-making as civilian politicians proved unable to cope with the escalating crisis. Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff effectively established a military dictatorship that subordinated all aspects of German society to the requirements of total war, transforming Berlin into the administrative center of a militarized state. The introduction of unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917 represented a desperate gamble to break the Allied blockade before American intervention could tip the balance definitively against Germany. This decision was made in Berlin by military commanders who calculated that they could starve Britain into submission before the United States could mobilize its vast resources for the European conflict. However, the entry of American forces into the war fundamentally changed the strategic situation and made German defeat increasingly inevitable. Berlin's military planners watched helplessly as fresh American divisions arrived on the Western Front, while Germany's own reserves of manpower and materials approached complete exhaustion. The Great Offensive of spring 1918 represented Germany's final attempt to achieve victory before overwhelming Allied superiority made continued resistance impossible. Berlin's newspapers proclaimed that this would be the decisive campaign that would finally bring the war to a successful conclusion, but military leaders privately acknowledged that failure would mean complete collapse. The collapse, when it came, was swift and total. By October 1918, German armies were in full retreat, while revolutionary movements erupted throughout the empire. Berlin itself became the center of a popular uprising that would sweep away not only the military leadership, but the entire imperial system that had governed Germany for nearly half a century. Sailors from the German fleet arrived in Berlin to join with workers and soldiers in demanding an immediate end to the war and the establishment of a democratic republic. The red flag was raised over government buildings as revolutionary councils seized control of key institutions throughout the city. Kaiser Wilhelm II, faced with the complete breakdown of military and civilian authority, was forced to abdicate and flee to exile in the Netherlands. The announcement of his abdication was made from the steps of the Reichstag building, marking the end of more than 4 centuries of Hohenzollern rule over Berlin and Brandenburg. The proclamation of the German Republic on November 9, 1918, represented one of the most dramatic moments in Berlin's entire history. The city that had served as the capital of Prussian kings and German Kaisers now found itself at the center of an experiment in democratic government that would face enormous challenges from both left and right-wing extremists. The armistice signed on November 11, 1918, ended the fighting but left Berlin and all of Germany facing an uncertain future. The city's population had endured 4 years of hardship and sacrifice, only to see their sacrifices rendered meaningless by military defeat and political revolution. The proud imperial capital had been transformed into the chaotic center of a republic that few Germans had wanted or expected. The immediate aftermath of defeat brought new forms of suffering to Berlin's residents. The continued Allied blockade maintained food shortages well into 1919, while returning soldiers struggled to find employment in an economy devastated by war and revolution. Political violence erupted regularly as competing factions battled for control of the new republic's institutions. The Spartacist uprising of January 1919 brought street fighting to Berlin's center as communist revolutionaries attempted to overthrow the provisional government and establish a Soviet-style regime. Government forces, supported by right-wing paramilitary groups, eventually suppressed the revolt, but not before significant damage had been done to the city's infrastructure and civilian morale. The assassination of communist leaders Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg during the suppression of the uprising created martyrs for the revolutionary left, while demonstrating the brutal methods that would characterize political conflict throughout the Weimar period. Berlin had become a city where political disagreements were increasingly resolved through violence rather than democratic debate. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany that would have lasting consequences for Berlin and its inhabitants. Territorial losses, military restrictions, and enormous reparation payments created economic burdens that would plague the new republic throughout its brief existence. Berlin's residents struggled to comprehend how completely their world had changed in just a few short years. The confident imperial capital of 1914 had been transformed into the uncertain seat of a democratic republic that faced hostility from both domestic enemies and foreign powers determined to keep Germany weak and divided. The hyperinflation crisis of the early 1920s brought additional misery to Berlin's middle class. As lifetime savings were wiped out and fixed incomes became worthless almost overnight. Citizens carried wheelbarrows full of currency to buy basic necessities, while speculators and profiteers accumulated vast fortunes through manipulation of the chaotic monetary system. Yet even in these desperate circumstances, Berlin's residents demonstrated the resilience that had carried them through previous crises. Cultural life experienced a remarkable renaissance as artists, writers, and performers explored new forms of expression that reflected the city's traumatic experiences and uncertain future. The cabarets, theatres, and nightclubs of 1920s Berlin became legendary throughout Europe for their innovative performances and provocative content. This cultural flowering represented both an escape from political and economic difficulties and an attempt to create new forms of meaning in a world where traditional values had been shattered by war and revolution. The construction of new housing developments and public works projects provided employment for thousands of workers, while beginning the process of modernizing Berlin's infrastructure for the 20th century. These ambitious undertakings demonstrated the Republic's commitment to social progress despite the enormous challenges it faced. However, the fundamental instability that characterized Weimar Germany ensured that Berlin would continue to experience dramatic changes and upheavals throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. The city that had survived medieval conflicts, religious wars, and imperial collapse was about to face its greatest test yet, as new forms of extremism threatened to destroy everything that generations of Berliners had worked to build and preserve. The economic prosperity that briefly returned to Berlin in the mid-1920s proved to be fragile and short-lived. When the global depression struck in 1929, the city once again found itself at the center of a crisis that would ultimately determine not only Germany's future, but the fate of all Europe. The rise of radical political movements during these troubled years would soon transform Berlin from a center of democratic experimentation into the capital of a regime that would bring unprecedented destruction and suffering to the city and its inhabitants. The stage was set for the darkest chapter in Berlin's long and turbulent history. The rise of the Nazi Party from a fringe political movement to the dominant force in German politics unfolded with terrifying speed during the final years of the Weimar Republic. Berlin, as the epicenter of German political life, witnessed this transformation firsthand as brown-shirted stormtroopers began appearing on street corners and radical rhetoric replaced reasoned debate in the halls of government. The economic devastation that followed the 1929 stock market crash created fertile ground for extremist messages throughout Germany, but nowhere was this more evident than in Berlin's working-class districts. Unemployment soared to unprecedented levels as factories closed and businesses collapsed, leaving millions of citizens desperate for solutions that traditional politicians seemed unable to provide. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party skillfully exploited this desperation, promising simple answers to complex problems while scapegoating minority groups for Germany's mounting difficulties. Their rallies in Berlin's largest venues drew enormous crowds of supporters who had lost faith in democratic institutions and yearned for strong leadership that would restore national pride and economic prosperity. The street battles between Nazi stormtroopers and communist paramilitaries that erupted throughout Berlin during the early 1930s created an atmosphere of constant tension and fear. Citizens hurrying to work or shopping for necessities never knew when they might encounter violent confrontations between rival political factions determined to impose their vision on German society. The democratic parties that had governed Germany since 1918 proved incapable of responding effectively to these challenges. Their leaders engaged in endless debates and political maneuvering, while ordinary Berliners watched their savings disappear and their job prospects evaporate in the face of an economic crisis that seemed to have no end. President Hindenburg's fateful decision to appoint Hitler as Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, marked the beginning of the end for democratic government in Germany. The aging war hero believed he could control and manipulate the Nazi leader, but this calculation would prove to be one of the most catastrophic misjudgments in European history. The transformation of Berlin under Nazi rule began immediately and proceeded with a methodical efficiency that demonstrated the regime's determination to remake German society according to their radical ideology. Within weeks of Hitler's appointment, the city's political landscape had been fundamentally altered as democratic institutions were systematically dismantled or brought under party control. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, provided the pretext for emergency measures that effectively ended constitutional government in Germany. Berlin's residents watched in shock as civil liberties were suspended and thousands of political opponents were arrested in sweeping raids that targeted anyone who might pose a threat to Nazi authority. The establishment of concentration camps on the outskirts of Berlin served notice that the new regime would tolerate no opposition to its policies. These facilities, initially designed to hold political prisoners, would eventually become part of a vast network of camps that stretched across Nazi-controlled Europe and served purposes too horrific for most citizens to comprehend. The cultural life that had flourished in Berlin during the 1920s was quickly brought into line with Nazi ideology through a combination of censorship, intimidation, and outright violence. Books were burned in public ceremonies, while artists, writers, and intellectuals who refused to conform to party doctrine were forced into exile or silence. The transformation of Berlin's Jewish community from valued citizens to persecuted outcasts unfolded gradually but relentlessly throughout the 1930s. Legal restrictions, economic boycotts, and social ostracism made daily life increasingly difficult for Jewish families who had considered themselves fully integrated into German society. The November 1938 pogrom known as Kristallnacht brought organized violence to Berlin streets as synagogues were burned, Jewish businesses were destroyed, and thousands of innocent citizens were arrested simply because of their religious heritage. The broken glass that littered the sidewalks the following morning served as a grim reminder of how quickly civilization could collapse into barbarism. Despite these ominous developments, many Berliners initially supported the Nazi regime because it appeared to be delivering on its promises of economic recovery and national renewal. Unemployment declined dramatically as massive public works projects provided jobs for millions of workers, while impressive displays of military might restore German confidence after years of international humiliation. The 1936 Olympic Games showcased Nazi Berlin to the world as a modern, prosperous capital that had overcome the chaos and weakness of the Weimar period. Foreign visitors were impressed by the city's magnificent new buildings, efficient organisation, and apparent social harmony, though few looked beneath the surface to see the repression and violence that maintained this facade. The regime's preparation for war became increasingly evident as the 1930s progressed. Berlin's factories retooled for military production, while the city's young men were conscripted into an expanding army that would soon embark on campaigns of conquest across Europe. The capital that had once been a centre of international cooperation was now the headquarters of an aggressive military machine. Hitler's decision to launch World War II in September 1939 transformed Berlin once again into a wartime capital, though the initial campaigns in Poland and Western Europe proceeded so successfully that many residents believed they were witnessing the birth of a new German empire that would dominate Europe for generations to come. The early victories in France, Norway, and the Low Countries created a euphoric atmosphere in Berlin as citizens celebrated what appeared to be the vindication of Nazi ideology and German military superiority. Victory parades, propaganda films, and constant radio broadcasts reinforced the message that Germany was destined to rule over a reorganized European continent. However, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 marked the beginning of a campaign that would ultimately bring catastrophe to Berlin and all of Germany. The initial successes that brought German armies to the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad created false confidence that the war in the East would be concluded quickly and decisively. The entry of the United States into the conflict following Pearl Harbor fundamentally changed the strategic balance and made ultimate German defeat increasingly likely. Berlin's planners now faced the prospect of fighting a global war against enemies whose combined resources far exceeded anything Germany could mobilize. The first Allied bombing raids on Berlin in 1940 had been more symbolic than destructive, but as the war progressed, these attacks became larger, more frequent, and devastatingly effective. Citizens who had cheered the regime's early victories now found themselves huddling in air raid shelters as their own city came under assault from the skies. The failed German offensive at Stalingrad during the winter of 1942-43 marked the turning point of the war and the beginning of an inexorable retreat that would eventually bring enemy armies to Berlin's gates. The city's residents gradually realized that the promises of easy victory had been replaced by the grim reality of a struggle for national survival. Food rationing became increasingly severe as the war dragged on, while consumer goods disappeared from stores as all industrial production was directed toward military needs. Berlin's civilians experienced hardships reminiscent of World War I, though the regime's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to maintain morale and suppress any signs of defeatism. The systematic murder of European Jewry, coordinated from offices in Berlin, represented the most horrific aspect of Nazi rule. While many citizens remained unaware of the full scope of these crimes, the disappearance of Jewish neighbours and the arrival of trainloads of deportees created an atmosphere of fear and complicity that would haunt the city for decades to come. As Allied forces advanced from both east and west during 1944, Berlin's residents began preparing for what seemed to be an inevitable siege. The construction of defensive positions throughout the city, the mobilization of elderly men and young boys into military units, and the stockpiling of supplies in underground bunkers all indicated that the final battle for Nazi Germany would be fought in its capital. The massive air raids that devastated Berlin during the final years of the war destroyed much of the city's historical centre and left hundreds of thousands of residents homeless. The magnificent buildings that had symbolised German power and culture lay in ruins, while survivors struggled to maintain basic services amid the constant threat of death from above. The approach of Soviet armies during the early months of 1945 created panic among Berlin's civilian population, who had been told horrific stories about the treatment they could expect from vengeful enemy soldiers. Millions of refugees from eastern Germany streamed into the city, overwhelming its already strained resources and creating chaotic conditions that presaged the coming collapse. Hitler's decision to remain in Berlin for the final battle, despite the pleas of his advisors to establish a new capital in southern Germany, ensured that the city would become the scene of the Nazi regime's last stand. The construction of an elaborate bunker complex beneath the government district provided the dictator with a secure refuge from which to direct the hopeless defense of his crumbling empire. The Battle of Berlin began on April 16, 1945, as massive Soviet forces launched their final offensive against the German capital. The city's defenders, consisting of a mixture of regular troops, police units, elderly men from the Volkssturm militia, and teenage boys from the Hitler Youth, could offer only token resistance against overwhelming enemy superiority. Street fighting raged throughout the city for more than 2 weeks as Soviet forces methodically advanced toward the government center. Berlin's civilians huddled in basements and subway tunnels while the battle raged above them, emerging occasionally to search for food or water amid the rubble of their destroyed neighborhoods. Hitler's suicide in his bunker on April 30th, 1945, marked the symbolic end of the Nazi regime, though fighting continued for several more days as die-hard defenders refused to accept defeat. The formal surrender of Berlin on May 2nd, 1945, brought an end to the most destructive war in human history and left the city in ruins both physical and moral. The magnitude of destruction that greeted the Allied victors was almost incomprehensible. More than half of Berlin's buildings had been damaged or destroyed, while basic infrastructure such as water, electricity, and transportation systems had completely collapsed. The proud capital that had once symbolized German power and ambition now lay in smoldering ruins, its population traumatized and its future uncertain. The discovery of the Holocaust's full scope, combined with evidence of other Nazi crimes, forced Berlin's surviving residents to confront the horrific reality of what their government had done in their name. The moral reckoning that accompanied military defeat would prove to be as challenging as the physical task of rebuilding their devastated city. The division of Berlin among the 4 Allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, created an entirely new political situation that would define the city's development for the next 4 decades. What had once been the unified capital of a centralized state was now partitioned into separate zones of occupation, each governed according to different political and economic principles. The contrast between the western sectors, administered by democratic powers, committed to rebuilding Germany as a peaceful member of the international community, and the eastern sector, controlled by the Soviet Union and increasingly oriented toward communist ideology, would soon create tensions that threatened to tear the city apart once again. The Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949, when Soviet forces attempted to starve the western sectors into submission by cutting off all land access to the city, demonstrated how completely the wartime alliance had collapsed into mutual hostility and suspicion. The successful Allied airlift that sustained West Berlin's population for nearly a year became a symbol of Western determination to resist Soviet expansion. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 physically divided the city and separated families, friends, and neighbors in ways that seemed to make permanent the ideological split that had emerged from the war's aftermath. The brutal efficiency with which East German authorities sealed their sector created a prison state that would endure for nearly 3 decades. Yet even in division, Berlin remained a city of extraordinary resilience and determination. West Berlin developed into a vibrant democratic enclave that demonstrated the appeal of freedom and prosperity, while East Berlin became the showcase capital of a communist state that claimed to represent the true interests of the German working class. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, marked the beginning of yet another dramatic transformation as the city prepared once again to serve as the capital of a unified German state. The joy and celebration that accompanied reunification could not entirely erase the scars left by decades of division, but they demonstrated that Berlin's capacity for renewal and regeneration remained as strong as ever. The process of reunification, while cause for tremendous celebration, presented Berlin with challenges that were perhaps as complex as any the city had faced throughout its tumultuous history. Two very different societies, shaped by 4 decades of opposing ideologies, had to somehow merge into a single functioning community while maintaining the distinct character that made each side valuable. East Berlin's infrastructure had deteriorated significantly during the communist era, with crumbling buildings, outdated transportation systems, and environmental damage that would require massive investment to repair. The contrast with West Berlin's modern facilities and prosperous neighborhoods created immediate tensions as residents on both sides struggled to understand how such different worlds could coexist within the same city. The economic integration proved especially challenging as East German businesses, accustomed to centralized planning and guaranteed markets, found themselves unable to compete in the free market economy. Unemployment soared in the eastern districts as inefficient factories closed, and workers discovered that their skills were often incompatible with Western business practices. Yet the determination to succeed was evident throughout the city as residents from both sides worked to bridge the gaps that decades of separation had created. Construction crews labored around the clock to repair damaged infrastructure, while cultural institutions organized events designed to bring together people who had lived just miles apart but in completely different worlds. The decision to make Berlin the capital of reunified Germany once again transformed the city's role and significance. Government ministries relocated from Bonn, bringing thousands of civil servants and their families to a city still struggling to define its new identity. The massive construction projects required to house the federal government created jobs and investment opportunities that helped fuel the reunification process. The rebuilding of the Reichstag as the seat of the German parliament symbolized both continuity with the democratic traditions that had been interrupted by dictatorship and war, and hope for a future based on peaceful cooperation rather than conflict and division. The building's glass dome, designed to allow citizens to literally look down on their representatives, embodied the transparency and accountability that would characterize the new Germany. Immigration from around the world accelerated as Berlin's reputation as a dynamic, tolerant city attracted people seeking new opportunities and experiences. The multicultural neighborhoods that emerged reflected both the city's historical tradition of welcoming newcomers and its contemporary commitment to diversity and inclusion. From the medieval trading posts along the Spree River to the gleaming capital of modern Europe, Berlin's extraordinary journey reveals the remarkable resilience of human civilization. This city has risen from ashes more times than perhaps any other, transforming conquest into opportunity, division into unity, and destruction into renewal. Today's Berlin stands as living proof that even the darkest chapters cannot define a city's ultimate destiny. As you walk through its streets tomorrow, remember that beneath your feet lies the foundation of 1,000 stories, each one testament to the enduring power of hope over despair.